The production team selected 10 top wilderness survival experts and deployed them to the Arctic region of Canada. Whoever lasts 100 days will win a $1 million prize. As the helicopter departed, each contestant was delivered to their drop-off point. The first contestant introduced was Sean, who had gained 3 million followers online through his survival videos. A devoted fan of solo wilderness living, he had spent the past 2.5 years honing his skills, building shelters, and making tools, all in preparation for this challenge. Upon finding a toolbox the crew had placed a day earlier, Sean noticed several bear paw prints on it and thought, "I can't confront it, but I can certainly avoid it." With his gear, he moved away from this ominous area. Having settled in a new location, Sean quickly assembled his bow and arrows and went to scout the nearby area. Overcome with excitement, he suddenly spotted something, held his breath, and shot an arrow. A dark shape fell from a tree. It was a porcupine. Within half an hour of landing, Sean had secured a substantial amount of protein. He cleaned it by the lake, made a roasting rack out of branches, and slow-cooked the torso for hours. However, the dry grass and wood in the Arctic were somewhat damp, and it took Sean several minutes to get the fire going. He stewed the 4 large legs in a pot, and the taste was better than expected, making him hum in satisfaction to the camera. The second contestant, Joe, a biologist from the National Park Service, was also adept with plants and animals and skilled in making traps and starting fires by friction. Like Sean, he explored his surroundings upon landing. Attracted by chattering squirrels in the trees, Joe, who had not brought a bow and arrow but was proficient in baseball, threw stones at the squirrels, attempting to knock them down. Like everyone else, I doubted his chances. Surprisingly, he managed to kill a squirrel with a stone, proving the contestants' exceptional skills this season. That evening, Sean heard something tampering with his iron pot outside the camp. It was likely a bear or a wolf. Armed with his bow and arrows, he bravely went to check. The visitor was scared away, but the pot had indeed been tampered with. After this incident, Sean was too nervous to sleep. On the second day of the challenge, female contestant Kaylin was still figuring out the local wildlife. To be safe, she set up 7 rope traps. Along the way, she found some spruce resin, and remembering that Native Americans chew it, she tried it out of curiosity. 3 seconds later, she couldn't spit it out fast enough due to its terrible taste. Guessing the area was rich in resources, she had set the traps only 2 hours before noon and already caught a rabbit. Kaylin cried holding the dead rabbit, but returned to the camp to cook it with mushrooms, finding some solace in her meal. The next contestant is Roland, a licensed hunting guide in Alaska who lives a semi-modern, self-sufficient life. He frankly stated that he would have to be dragged away from the contest for the $1 million prize. Early in the morning, he started a fire to smoke out black ants hidden in the wood. Believing that even mosquitoes are meat, he pinched each ant and ate them. Afterward, he went out to look for game traces, but stumbled upon a large spool of fishing line. Thinking of making a fishhook to add to his gear, he walked to the lake to find a fishing spot. Unexpectedly, a wolverine scurried out from under a rock. Roland then cheerfully took out his battle axe, ready to confront the wolverine if necessary. The scene switched back to Joe. Perhaps feeling lightheaded from eating squirrel, he foolishly decided to bathe in 3-degree water, immediately regretting it and hurriedly getting dressed. He collected several scarlet fungi nearby, planning to stew them with meat. While exploring the bushes and noticing numerous animal tracks, he hadn't decided how to set traps when he spotted a black bear about 100 meters away. Lacking both a bow and a battle axe, anyone else might have fled, but Joe decided to confront the bear and drive it away from his camp. Thanks to his experience at the National Park Service, he managed to scare the bear away after about 10 minutes. Having eaten rabbit stewed with mushrooms, Kaylin used her energy to build a winter shelter. Initially planning for a luxurious tent, she considered her solo status and opted for a simpler, classic A-frame design. She used logs for walls, stuffed moss into the gaps, and left a large entrance. She covered the roof with a tarp and additional branches, creating a durable, wear-resistant wooden hut. Sitting inside eating stewed meat, her life seemed quite comfortable compared to Joe, who was still living in a makeshift shelter. After driving away the black bear yesterday, he set several traps in the bushes. This morning, he checked the traps, hoping for just 500 calories a day. Unfortunately, His skills did not allow for much, but as he entered the bushes, he saw a rabbit caught in a trap. Just as Joe was overjoyed, he noticed another trap had also caught a rabbit. Now, he had 2 rabbits to satisfy his desire to stew meat with scarlet fungi. On the 10th day of the challenge, Sean had completed 30% of his winter shelter. It seemed like he was settling down for the long haul. In his downtime, he entertained himself and the camera crew. The porcupine he had previously caught was already eaten. Today, he planned to quickly find more food to keep up with the construction of his shelter. Lucky for him, just a few hundred meters out, he found an abandoned boat under some broken branches. However, his luck turned when he returned to camp to start a fire and realized he couldn't find his fire starter. After searching his previous clothes and not finding it, he thought it might have dropped on his way back to camp. He retraced his steps for over 3 hours. As happy as he was before, he was now equally distressed. Starting a fire by friction wasn't his forte, especially with everything slightly damp. Facing the prospect of the Arctic winter without fire, Sean reluctantly made the call to withdraw from the competition. Rewinding to day 5, Roland was busy harvesting various berries from the grassland. He seasoned them in his boots before storing them in hollow tree trunks. Over the past few days, he filled 5 such trunks with berries. Building his winter shelter also became a priority. He found a large pile of rocks and planned to use them to construct a stone house. Building walls from scattered stones, some weighing up to 180 kilograms, was not an easy task. Fortunately, Roland was strong. Although the construction was laborious, the rock walls would reflect the heat from the fire, making his stone house the warmest among the contestants. After 2 days, he finished the walls and chimney, stuffing moss into the gaps. Next, he built the roof, choosing thick spruce trees for the task. Each processed log weighed nearly 200 kilograms, a testament to his ambitious efforts. After setting up the roof's base, the rest was relatively easy. The scene shifts to the 5th contestant, Mark, who served in the U.S. Army for 10 years. 2 years ago, he started teaching courses on shooting, survival, mountaineering, and tracking. Mark, skilled in various survival techniques, joined the competition to save money for his 1-year-old son's baby formula. While other contestants focused on hunting land animals, Mark had already set up his fishing nets early. He caught more fish than expected today. 4 in total, 2 lake trout, and 2 whitefish. Now, only the main door of his shelter remained to be built. His immediate task was to process these fish. Mark built a semicircular stone hearth inside his house, with 3 stone slabs protruding in the middle as a cooking surface. He filleted the fish, removed the heads, and cut them into small pieces to be dehydrated on the smoke rack above the hearth, providing enough food for the next several days. The next contestant to appear is a woman named Crawley. She spent most of her adulthood outdoors, mastering all survival skills. Hunting animals and processing their hides are routine for her. She started by setting snares for rabbits in the bushes and gradually familiarized herself with larger animals and fish. One day, while hunting with her bow and arrow, Crawley spotted a pack of wolves in the bushes ahead. She was excited and decided to follow them to see what was happening. As expected, she quickly lost sight of them. Whether Crawley's hunting skills are good remains unknown, but she certainly isn't less courageous than the male contestants. The camera then cuts to the 7th contestant, Corey, who made a spectacular debut by shooting a squirrel with his arrow. Born into a family of hunters and gatherers, he has been handling bows and arrows since childhood. He joined the competition to win the prize money and live a free life. So far, he has built most of the framework of his house and a 3-layer log bed. Next, he plans to use logs to build walls on both sides, sawing off the excess and filling the gaps with moss. His craftsmanship is both exquisite and beautiful. Unfortunately, while carrying wood back to camp, he slipped and fell, hearing a dull sound in his left knee, which had undergone surgery 13 years ago. Despite the pain, tempted by the $1 million prize, he decided to endure it and see if it would heal in the next few days. Today, he finished the sides of the wooden hut, covered it with a tarp, and laid a thick layer of branches, declaring it complete. The 8th contestant, Amos, learned wilderness survival as a child to avoid war. Now 40, he is skilled in many areas, including making traps, fire by friction, building shelters, and identifying edible plants. Like Mark, he also set up fishing nets early. At the lake, he found a 3 to 4 pound burbo in his net, enough to feed him for 2 days. While cleaning the fish, a wolf, attracted by the smell, came close but wisely walked away due to the size difference. On the 9th day, Mark, having caught 4 fish in one net, has been enjoying several pots of fish head soup these days. He can't afford to waste the fatty fish ice as he needs it to maintain his weight. Now, only the main door of his shelter remains to be built. He grouped 4 logs, securing horizontal supports at the top and bottom, with a layer of spruce branches sandwiched between 2 wooden planks, creating his door. After finishing, he wanted to rest, but was disturbed by the cawing of crows outside. Years of wilderness experience told Mark that there might be a predator nearby. He went outside and saw a black bear roaming around the camp, likely attracted by the smell of smoked fish. He quietly followed the bear downwind, hoping to follow it back to its den and kill it for meat that could last him 2 months. Unfortunately, by 3:30 p.m., the bear had vanished. Mark then mimicked the distress call of a rabbit to try and lure the bear. After waiting half an hour without seeing the bear, he returned to camp. Corey, having caught no significant prey, quickly crafted a fishing net from parachute cord to improve his diet. By day 10, he needed to add notches to his belt to tighten his pants. Without substantial food, he risked being removed from the show. Despite daily hunting trips with his bow and arrow, he saw no rabbits nearby. His hopes now rested on the makeshift net. Fortunately, it paid off, catching a fish weighing 2.5 pounds, enough for a hearty meal. He rushed back to cook it, patiently waiting 15 minutes before enjoying the steaming fish. Corey also focused on a balanced diet, eating berries daily for vitamins. His only concern was the pain from a knee injury days earlier, which had worsened. He felt a large, fluid-filled sac in his knee, indicating a recurrence of an old injury. That night, he felt feverish and struggled with sleep, the pain in his knee intensifying. Realizing his body's healing was insufficient, and with the competition far from over, he had no choice but to withdraw to recover. The scene shifts to Crawley. Her previous shelter was inadequate, so she found a better location to start anew. Before breaking ground, she needed to gather food. On a rocky hill, she heard something below and spotted a porcupine napping. Excitedly, she shot it with an arrow, followed by another to ensure it was dead. This catch, weighing about 10 pounds, ranked among the top 5 prey in the area. After spending minutes skinning and cleaning, Crawley had enough meat for the next few days to fuel her shelter building. The 9th contestant, Joel, grew up in South Africa and Tanzania, learning survival and hunting skills from the Maasai. He joined the competition for a better life for his family. By day 8, he had only caught a rabbit and a squirrel. Today he ventured further, finding fresh moose tracks in the bushes and a muskox skeleton on the ground, suggesting a good number of large animals in the area. He took the muskox skull back to camp as a totem, talking to it each morning to alleviate loneliness. While his bow hunting yielded little, his fishing net was more successful, catching a white fish weighing about 2.5 pounds today. Over the next 3 days, the net brought in 4 more fish. Joel wanted to build a food storage on a tree to avoid black bears and wolverines. He first made a ladder and chose 3 adjacent spruce trees. He cut off the obstructive lower branches and then climbed the ladder to trim the excess tree crowns. Unfortunately, a falling tree crown knocked him down unexpectedly. Luckily, he was not injured. Eventually, he built a platform on the 3 trees and stored smoked fish meat on it. The last contestant, Keith, has over 30 years of wilderness survival experience. Skilled in hunting, fishing, and setting traps, he joined the competition to win the prize money, quit his job, and spend more time enjoying the wilderness. Although he has been hunting daily, he has not seen any large game yet. Today, he finally found fresh moose droppings. After searching the forest for a while, he heard a squirrel chattering. Keith drew his bow and shot it, catching the falling squirrel with one hand. This smooth operation was impressive. He took it back, cleaned it, and saved the meat for dinner, using the innards as fish bait. He practices full utilization, wasting nothing. The scene switches to Kaylin, who found a metal fishing lure on the beach. Planning to try her luck at the lake near her shelter, she was not short on protein, having caught rabbits with snare traps. She wanted to fish to add some fats to her diet. Her fishing net had not caught anything since being placed in the water. Thinking the area was low in fish, Kaylin took a sleeping bag, an axe, and other equipment to a spot 1.6 kilometers away, believing the fishing chances were better there. After 2.5 hours, she finally got a fish on the line. but it escaped halfway through reeling it in. However, this confirmed that there were fish in the area. She camped there overnight and started fishing again at 8 a.m. the next day. By 10:30 a.m., she had given up on catching fish. As she was about to pack up, she spotted a 600-pound moose about 30 meters away. The moose, seeing her, quickly entered the lake, attempting to swim to the other side. Kaylin mimicked the call of an estrus female moose, successfully attracting its attention. Just as she was about to shoot it with her bow, she realized she had not brought her bow and arrow, leaving her completely frustrated. On the 11th day, Amos started his morning with Native American calisthenics, expressing gratitude for nature's gifts. He then checked his gill net, which had caught a northern pike today. Since the start, his fish supply had never run out, totaling 11 fish. He wasted nothing, using fish heads for soup and drying the meat for his main food. He hung the surplus on trees for storage, hoping to avoid bears and wolverines. If everything continued this way, he had a good chance of making it to 100 days. However, the inevitable still arrived. Just after Amos had finished a big meal, he heard animals moving outside his shelter. Taking his bow and arrow, he went out to see who it was. He saw a wolverine quickly running back into the forest. Seeing that the dried fish meat hanging from the tree was still there, he returned to his shelter satisfied and continued resting. Joe was in the worst situation. After eating the wild rabbit and squirrel he caught, he now relied solely on berries and mushrooms for food. His winter shelter had yet to be started. Being quite skinny, he wanted his shelter to be well built, so he even brought a chisel with him. He cleaned up a large tree, tied ropes around the top, and raised it using a human-shaped frame. He then inserted a crossbeam at the top with a dovetail joint and used mortise and tenon joints at the base. He installed 8 foot-locking poles between 2 human frames. Continuing the construction would take a lot of effort. By the 15th day, Joe started his morning with a series of lightning 5 whips exercises to stretch his muscles. He then went to check his traps, which had been empty for days. Disheartened and preparing to go back to chewing on berries, Joe saw a squirrel hiding in a hole. He grabbed a sharpened stick to try to kill it, but failed after struggling for a while. He planned to get a longer stick and try again. Unfortunately, he didn't block the hole, allowing the squirrel to escape. Probably a few days without meat had dulled his mind, leading to such a basic mistake. Back to Keith, he made himself a pair of earrings using berry juice and animal bones. Maintaining a positive attitude is crucial for survival. Now that he had the right mindset, he was just unsure about the outcome with his fishing line. But it didn't disappoint him. The fishing line caught a 2.5-pound plump lakefish with appetizing bright yellow flesh. He grilled the meat on a rack and saved the bones and head for making soup. The smoked dried fish, rich in protein, offered a distinct flavor. By the 14th day, Roland's trap finally caught a squirrel. Having not seen meat for days, he was overjoyed. After his meal, he still needed to complete the roofing of his stone house. He cut down 10 nearby trees and laid them flat to fit just right. Next, he stuffed moss into the gaps and covered them with a tarpaulin to finish the job. 2 days later, since he hadn't caught any game, Roland dug up a lot of irises. Not only are they medicinal, treating heatiness and fever, but every 100 grams contain 5 grams of protein and 3 grams of fat, making them an excellent survival food. Roland stored the dug-up irises in a cave, similar to how contestant Kaylin stored her fishing net. His net had not been successful, so he decided to move it to a deeper water area, hoping to quickly provide him with a protein-rich meal. On day 17, Mark was the fishing champion of the season. His fishing net caught 2 carp today. While other contestants worried about food, he had already secured his protein needs. So far, his net had brought in 26 fish, with 18 still stored. His shelter's smoking rack was too small, so he built a large triangular one outside. He lined it with spruce branches to contain the smoke and added an alarm system to prevent animals from stealing the fish at night. Eating high-fat fish daily, Mark developed diarrhea. He gathered reindeer moss nearby to balance his diet and improve his health. After eating the moss, he searched for berries and blueberries to help his stomach. By chance, he found a path made by a black bear and thought of hunting it. Next, he saw a bear in the berry field by the sea. Realizing bears visited whenever he left, he quickly returned with his bow and arrow to ambush in the berry field. Keith, in contrast, had only caught 1 trout with his fishing line. This morning, he faced a food shortage, but still made a tattoo needle from a bone. He mixed charcoal with racal to make ink and tattooed 25 dots near his ankle to connect with the land. He then crafted a fishing net, soaked it in racal juice to blend with the lake water, and set it in the shallows at night, hoping fish would swim into it while avoiding predators. On day 18, Crawley had finished eating the porcupine she caught 7 days ago and had nearly completed building her winter home. It was time to search for food. Her first snare trap caught nothing, but the second trapped a plump winter rabbit. She brought it back to her shelter, skinned it, and removed its organs, securing food for 2 more days. After solving her food needs, she found clay near her camp and decided to make more pots. She shaped the clay into coils, stuck them together, and successfully made 2 pottery jars by evening, useful for cooking or storing water. The scene shifts to Joel, who had just shot 2 rabbits in the forest. His action camera malfunctioned, but he still demonstrated the process professionally. When you see a rabbit, don't approach stealthily, as it will flee, seeing you as a predator. Instead, mimic a herbivore and approach slowly without making eye contact. Once in range, strike decisively to maximize the chance of hitting the rabbit. Joel cleaned the rabbits by the lake. He really got quite a bit of meat. Back at camp, he immediately stewed several rabbit legs and organs. He greatly enjoyed eating in front of the camera, finding the meat chewy and satisfying without being greasy. Its protein content is many times that of beef. After eating, it was time to work. He planned to make a door for the shelter by hammering 2 wooden stakes on either side of the wall. He then placed appropriately sized wooden bars between them to secure the door. Unexpectedly, a fly flew into Joel's ear while he worked. He never anticipated such an incident. He tried 3 or 4 methods but couldn't get the fly out. Finally, Joel took out an emergency medical kit and used a syringe to flush water into his ear, which finally dislodged the fly. He was relieved. The scene switches back to Keith. Since his fishing line and spear net had caught nothing, Keith turned to rock tripe as a last resort. Reportedly, George Washington's army survived the winter on this. Keith decided to follow in their footsteps. However, for him, used to eating fish, rock tripe was hard to swallow. It looked bouncy, but tasted like chewing mud. On day 21, Keith could no longer endure days of surviving on rock tripe and berries. After expressing his feelings to the camera, he took out a satellite phone to call the show's crew, asking for a pizza delivery. I thought he was quitting, but it turned out he was joking to entertain the audience. Later, Keith went to check his snare traps. After a long walk, he finally caught a squirrel. Having not seen meat for days, his eyes lit up. Back at camp, he quickly arranged to stew it in an iron pot. While eating, he even showed off his thighs to the camera. Perhaps the squirrel carried some bacteria, as Keith developed severe stomach cramps that night. By morning, trying to regain strength with squirrel soup only made his stomach churn again. Soon he couldn't even drink water. If this continued, his life was at risk. Realizing the severity, Keith hurriedly called the show's crew to quit. When the staff arrived, he was still vomiting. Roland wasn't doing much better. Today, checking his spear net moved to deeper waters, he was finally rewarded. He found 2 fish tangled in the net, a lake trout and a whitefish, each weighing 3 to 4 pounds. For once, he could see the possibility of reaching day 100. However, trouble arrived that night as the weather changed and huge waves hit. Roland risked going down the steep cliffs to retrieve his spear net to prevent it from being washed away. He wanted to reset the net, but looking at the unrelenting wind and waves, as well as the steep cliffs, he decided against taking the risk. The scene shifts to Joe. By day 12, he had constructed the framework of a wooden hut, but by day 13, it mostly remained unchanged. It's unclear whether this is due to the editing by the show's crew, or if he simply hasn't been doing much recently. Either way, he now lacks food and is still living under a tent supported by a few pieces of wood. This morning, he checked his traps and had mixed news. 2 snares had caught rabbits, but carnivores had gotten to them first, eating parts of both rabbits. The loss was minor and still acceptable. Since Joel currently isn't short on food, he shifted some of his focus to passing time. He first tied 2 extended lock poles on a tripod to create a backrest and a platform, crafting a makeshift wilderness chair. Then, using his hunting knife, he carved a few wooden pieces, dipped them in berry juice to make dice. Lastly, he trimmed a piece of birch wood, carved a large hole at the end, and added 3 pins to each side, securing them with wire to create his own kakuyuri. The scene returns to Roland, who is now sitting at his camp, enjoying a stewed large fish in an iron pot, reminiscing about his late mother. Today, as the lake surface gradually calmed, he returned his spear net to its original position. Just as he was about to go berry picking nearby, he suddenly spotted a black bear on a hillside 200 meters away. With a side wind blowing, he took up his bow and arrow, entering a hunting mode. He tracked the bear until 4:30 p.m. but lost it, wasting 2.5 hours. The scene switches to Kaylin, who, having just finished washing up, found washing her hair too troublesome and cut off her braids with a hunting knife, giving herself a new hairstyle. After tidying up, she took her bow and arrow to check her traps. The snares were moved but had not caught any game. Fortunately, this proved that there were indeed animals in the area. Kaylin searched unhurriedly. Squirrels, alarmed by her presence, ran off from a distance. After some time, she heard rustling in the bushes. Focusing for 3 seconds, she spotted a rabbit and released an arrow, striking the rabbit's throat precisely. It was another fruitful day. She planned to prepare the rabbit for dinner, but the poor smoke ventilation in her hut drove her outside. The next morning, she made a hole in the roof, surrounded it with clay, and found that starting a fire improved the smoke ventilation. She planned to further refine this. Another female contestant, Crawley, was also making improvements to her shelter. She wanted to build a fully enclosed melon guard hut. She gathered many stones from around her camp to construct a half-person tall fireplace, then sealed the gaps with clay. She piled wood on the upper half, sealing the gaps with moss, and created an entrance on the sheltered side, allowing Crawley to comfortably enjoy her food inside. On day 26, the tarp Joe used for his melon hut fluttered loudly in the wind, yet he still slept in late. I'm somewhat speechless about that. Today he wants to try fishing. Given his ambitious plans for a grand wooden house, he needs enough energy to continue building. After waiting for 2.5 hours, he finally felt a bite. The fish he pulled to shore was not small, big enough to eat for 2 days. Excited, Joe quickly grabbed the fish by the gills, fearing it might slip off the hook. This fish, weighing at least 5 kilos, might be commonplace for the expert fisherman Mark, but for Joe, it's a significant asset. This trout from the lake will fuel the ongoing construction of his house. Amos, the Indian contestant. Today, Amos found his fishing net empty, an unusual occurrence. With the weather getting colder, he planned to chop more firewood but realized his axe was missing. Using a headlamp, he searched in the falling snow. If the snow covered the axe, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack. As expected, Amos didn't find the axe and ended up with frozen hands and wet footwear. The next morning, a thin layer of snow revealed the handle of the lost axe, bringing him great joy. Without it, collecting firewood would have been difficult. Since Roland's spear net last caught 2 fish, there had been no activity, and he hadn't seen many animals either. On day 29, while digging for roots, Roland spotted a muskox nearby. Stealthily, he shot an arrow from 30 meters away, hitting the animal's hind leg. The thick-skinned muskox thought it was just a mosquito bite and considered moving on. Roland quietly followed. As evening approached with no sign of the muskox weakening, he decided to make a decisive move. Sensing danger, the muskox roared, but Roland charged with his hunting knife, quickly retreating after stabbing it. Seeing the animal's weak resistance, he rushed in for another strike. Roland's courage was undeniable. After these attacks, the muskox quickly fell and died. A successful hunt left Roland very happy. With only an hour and a half until dark, he didn't have enough time to process the whole animal. He ate some raw muskox heart to regain strength, removed the organs prone to bacteria, and took some parts back, leaving the rest hoping no other animals would find it. Roland slept until noon the next day. He returned with his bow and arrow to continue butchering the muskox. Worried about bears or wolverines stealing the meat overnight, he hurried along the path. Arriving, he was shocked to see the stomach on the rock completely eaten. Fortunately, the rest of the muskox was untouched. Roland then began the orderly task of butchering. He first removed the 2 large legs facing upwards and planned the 2 pounds of tenderloin cut for dinner. He also took 2 large slices of tenderloin with him. After nearly 3 hours of chopping and cutting, he managed to process the legs, shoulders, steaks, and lungs. However, Several hundred pounds of meat could not all be transported back today. Roland hid the meat at the top of the mountain, covered with ox hide and camouflaged with stones and branches. He would move it in batches to the shelter later. Switching to Indian contestant Amos, a black bear had visited his camp last night. This morning, he saw its droppings. Fearing the bear might enter the wooden house to steal smoked fish while he was away, he quickly made a stronger, more durable door. Then, he checked his spike net, which had caught fish almost daily until today. To his dismay, the net was swept away by the waves, almost his entire food supply gone. Now, he had to return to the shelter and weave a new one. Fortunately, he had brought parachute cord to the competition. It took him 2.5 hours to make a new spike net, which he placed back at the original spot by the lake. Over at Fisherman Mark's location, he had caught 7 or 8 fish and lake trout over the past few days. With no room in the shelter, he tied a horizontal beam in the tree and hung the fish in midair, hoping to keep them away from other predators. Like Amos, Mark's net was empty today. Considering the possibility that the fish had moved to warmer, deeper waters, he lowered his net by 3 meters. Then, he returned and used his socks as a towel to bathe himself with boiled water. The next day, he went to check the net and saw fresh black bear droppings on the way, feeling a bad omen. Sure enough, the net was empty again. Planning to take a fish from his food storage for dinner, he was stunned to find all the hanging fish eaten. Mark underestimated the black bear's intelligence, which had untied the rope to eat the fish. His previously stable survival situation became tense within 2 days, prompting him to plan to hunt the bear. He chose 3 adjacent trees, cut off the obstructive branches at the bottom, and constructed a triangular platform in midair overlooking a berry patch frequented by the bear. Meanwhile, Kaylin, having failed to catch fish for a while, devised a new plan. She had found a metal barrel by the lake yesterday and decided to build a raft centered around it this morning to fish in deeper waters. She chopped down several spruce trees nearby and made a catamaran-style raft, securing the barrel in the middle and placing logs at the front and back for extra buoyancy. With that, her boat was ready. Kaylin paddled towards the deep water sitting on a metal barrel. Although the raft floated, its balance was poor. Slight movements nearly tipped her into the lake, forcing her to quickly paddle back to shore. Falling into the icy water could have meant withdrawal from the competition. Compared to other contestants, Joe truly earned the title of King of Laziness in Season 7. From day 12, when he built the wooden frame, to day 32, it remained unchanged. Joe planned to spend a day building a shelter, but ended up cutting down 1 tree, fitting it into place, then lying down again. Soon, he found several holes in the tarp above him as it rained heavily outside and drizzled inside. The rain lasted until the next morning. Joe intermittently wiped the leaking water with animal fur, almost breaking down. By dawn, his sleeping bag was slightly wet and needed to be hung to dry. Seeing the effort required, he thought the competition might end before he finished his shelter. He then tied the tarp to the frame, declaring the shelter complete, thinking himself a genius. Back to Roland, he sat in his stone shelter preparing to eat boiled ox heart for lunch before transporting the remaining meat. Approaching the destination, he noticed many black bear tracks and found the fat-rich ox tongue and brain eaten. Fortunately, the meat hidden on the mountain was undiscovered. Roland carried a 50 to 60-pound ox leg back to his shelter 3 kilometers away. Unable to move all the meat today, it had to stay out another night. Previously, Amos had woven a spike net. On the 35th day of survival, coinciding with his daughter's 2nd birthday, perhaps blessed by her, he caught a northern pike big enough for 2 days' meals. Returning to Roland, transporting the musk ox was finally nearing completion. Roland neared his destination and suddenly noticed many fresh black bear tracks on the ground, making him tense. Looking around, he spotted the black bear that had been stealing muskox meat just ahead. He immediately went into hunting mode. On day 35 of survival, Mark, having suffered from the bear's theft and multiple failures with his spike net, was forced to dig into the snow to track animals. He hoped to set several snare traps for a rabbit feast. However, during his journey, he spotted fox tracks and territorial urine markings in the snow, realizing that having competitors was not good news. The scene shifts to Roland, who was sitting in his dimly lit stone hut, stewing a mix of beef offal. Soon, a half-pound of sirloin on the fire was cooked to a crisp on the outside and tender inside. After a short rest, Roland planned to build a food storage room. First, he needed to treat his leather gloves with black bear brain matter for maintenance, and also apply some on his hands and face for protection. He then grabbed an axe and furiously chopped at the surrounding spruce trees. If he wanted to prevent bears and wolves from stealing, the storage had to be secure. Roland stacked the chopped wood into a square using a birch egg structure, drove a pair of stakes at each corner, and secured them with wire. He placed the processed musk ox and bear meat inside, separating each layer with spruce branches, and covered the top with logs. He placed 2 logs longitudinally under the wire at the bottom of the stakes as a door bolt, making it nearly impossible for bears or wolves to break in. Turning to craftsman Joel, who had previously made a cocoa yurt, he planned to make a wooden bowl today to eat and drink simultaneously. However, just felling one tree and moving it back to camp exhausted him. Although he had 10 days' worth of fish meat stored, it was calculated at half his normal meal size. Therefore, Joel was in a semi-starved state during this period. It took him half an hour to chisel out the shape of the wooden bowl. He then placed some charcoal inside to burn the inner walls, making them smooth. The wooden bowl was completed. There was a noise from the food storage area. With uncertainty, he went out to check and indeed saw a wolverine circling below. He scared it off with a shout, thinking it had not yet succeeded in stealing. Only when he climbed the ladder to the treetop storage with his headlamp did he realize the wolverine had already managed to take some fish, as he saw scattered fish pieces on the ground. His treetop food storage was not secure at all. After a careful recount, he found the wolverine had stolen 10 chunks of fish. What was supposed to last 10 days would now barely last 4 days. Back to Mark. He went to check the traps he had set a few days ago early in the morning. On the way, he found a small patch of reindeer moss and collected it to add some vitamins and change from the daily monotony of eating fish. Reaching the first trap, he was surprised to find a fox caught in the noose. While the fox could have provided food for several days, it was a protected local species, so Mark had to release it. He also had to be cautious not to get bitten since the fox could carry rabies, which would mean automatic disqualification from the competition. Fortunately, the fox seemed to understand Mark did not want to harm it and did not resist much. As soon as Mark let go, the fox dashed back into the forest. Though he lost the fox, Mark found a snow hare in the remaining traps, and his fishing net unexpectedly caught a 2.5-pound pike. Overall, it was a bountiful day for him. Joel, having lost some fish, decided it was safer to store the remaining pieces inside his wooden cabin. He dug a 30-centimeter deep hole in a corner, surrounded it with wooden stakes, and filled the gaps with spruce branches. He then built a thick and tight base of snow, placed the fish pieces separated by branches, and finally covered it with a metal plate and stones on top, creating a makeshift wild fridge. After a short rest, Joel went outside to prepare firewood. Suffering from lack of carbs and fats, he experienced ketoacidosis, making him weak and heavy-legged. While sawing wood, he collapsed, fainting. It took a long time before he could stand again. After a night of deliberation, Joel decided to withdraw from the competition the next day, as his body was too weak to respond to his brain's commands, and he felt it wasn't worth risking his life. On day 39, a weasel entered Crawley's shelter. Considering its small size and feeling lonely, Crawley did not offer it food, but allowed it to leave the hut unharmed. She then went to check her traps and caught a snow hare in the first one, followed by 4 more snow hares from other traps set up. Could it be related to releasing the weasel? These 4 snow hares provided Crawley with 650 grams of protein and 70 grams of fat. Delighted, she couldn't help but sing praises to the land. On day 40, a blizzard forced Mark to stay inside his cabin. As usual, he took out his son's photo and talked to the camera about his longing. With some spare time, he carved a wooden plaque until evening, making a piece depicting a horse. Unexpectedly, a spark ignited the cabin. Mark quickly took his camera outside as the strong wind fueled the fire. He pulled out burning logs and threw them onto open ground. After extinguishing the fire, much of the wall was destroyed. He waited until dawn to start repairs, covering the damaged wall with a non-flammable tarp and planning to replace the burnt wood later. Arriving at Joe's place, he slept until noon. Afterwards, he spent half an hour groggily facing the camera before working on logs for building walls. He worked for 15 minutes and then took a break. He rested for 3 hours in his well-ventilated and well-lit shelter, waking up at 4 p.m. to check his traps. It seems this lazy guy is blessed with lazy luck. His lasso traps caught 4 snow hares in one day. He immediately stewed the meat upon returning and enjoyed a hearty meal before sleeping again. It's hard to comment on this contestant named Joe. He's been working on his shelter for a month, and it's still not half done. He's never used the provided fishing nets, relying solely on lasso traps for catching hares. The accumulated hare skins are piling up. As the lightest and least skilled contestant this season, he has managed to survive on an endless supply of rabbit meat. Moving to Indian Elder Amos, his situation is similar to Mark's. Initially, he thrived on fishing with nets, but as temperatures dropped, his luck changed. Now he's setting lasso traps in the forest. The animal tracks in the snow are clearly visible, making tracking easier for Amos. He set traps along a path frequented by snowshoe hares. On his way back, next to his shelter, he saw fox tracks and made a long spear that evening, preparing for any predator's intrusion. Meanwhile, a fox appeared on the shelter's outdoor camera. Soon after, Amos heard the cries of a snow hare, indicating it was caught in a trap. To prevent other predators from reaching it first, he quickly grabbed his newly made spear. Hearing Amos, the fox turned around and fled. Fortuitously, Amos was there first to dispatch the hare with a stick. The quick success of the trap was unexpected. At dawn, he took the hare to the lake, skinned it, and removed the organs, leaving 2 pounds of meat. After eating fish for a month, he was finally able to enjoy a different taste. As Amos returned to the camp, a fox, attracted by the scent, appeared on the beach. Unusually fearless, the fox came within 3 meters of Amos, ignoring his attempts to drive it away, and boldly followed the trail to where the hare was cleaned. After eating the discarded organs, the fox approached Amos again. This behavior was not just provocative, but outright disrespectful. Amos shot a blunt arrow at it, which wouldn't be lethal, but was enough to make it flee in pain. Now it's Kaylin's turn. Having never been away from her husband for so long, she deeply misses his embrace. After reflecting on this, she went to check her traps. On the way, she spotted footprints, which gave her a bad feeling. Sure enough, when Kaylin reached the traps, she found only remnants of hair fur and organs. Another trap was even worse, with only a few tufts of hair left. This situation deeply upset her, making her miss her husband even more. Fortunately, she still had some stored snow hair left to eat. Continuing with Joe, he was unsettled after hearing wolves howling during dinner, as he was the only contestant without a bow and arrow, leaving him to face the wolves with only an axe. By the next morning, everything was calm again, and he was slowly processing logs. Today was especially praiseworthy, as he usually processes 1 log and rests until the next day, but this time he diligently made 3 or 4 logs, nearly finishing half a wall. Now looking at Mark, the once proud fish king is now in a state of neglect. It's been 3 days, and he hasn't finished his cabin. He feels increasingly tired, and his mental state is deteriorating, sometimes even arguing with himself. This morning, he still felt hungry after eating half a fish, and couldn't understand why he felt constant hunger despite eating continuously. On day 44, a production crew's yacht broke the silence, indicating a contestant had withdrawn. As the cameraman landed, the focus turned to Joe. It was surprising that Joe withdrew without finishing the 4 snow hares he had caught. Joe mentioned that life was tough and his physical state couldn't keep up with the work and survival demands. We wish him well on his journey. Kaylin, after some mental preparation, managed to adjust her state. Today, her luck with the traps improved. After losing 2 snow hares yesterday, nature gifted her 3 today, instantly clearing her gloom. Looking at the fat on the rabbit meat, she felt hopeful about lasting 100 days. On the afternoon of Joe's withdrawal, Mark, due to his poor physical and mental state, also called the production team to announce his withdrawal. By day 45, only 4 contestants remained. Roland, despite not worrying about food due to his successful hunting of musk deer, is concerned because the deer meat is very low in fat. He has lost 20 kilograms so far, and today scraped some fatty tissues from under the scalp, barely enough for 2 to 3 days fat intake. The situation for the other contestants is not optimistic either. Amos is down to 3 fish and nearing starvation. His fishing nets have been fruitless and have developed large holes over time. He plans to retrieve the nets and wait to use them once the lake freezes. On his way back, he saw wolf tracks outside his shelter, causing some panic. Now, he must economize, and hopes the 3 remaining fish will last until the lake freezes. The scene shifts to Crawley, who previously relied on lassoing and hunting for food, but now faces a lack of fat. This morning, she spent some effort making a spike net, planning to set it up at her usual fishing spot. Looking around, the rocks by the lake were icy. Crawley slipped and fell, not only cutting her eyebrow, but also accidentally biting her lip. Concerned that asking for help from the production team might lead to a forced withdrawal due to her injuries, she used a mirror and gauze from the first aid kit to clean the blood off her face and return to the survival challenge. Crawley's resilience is admirable, surpassing many men. The spike net and fishing line can no longer be used as the lake begins to freeze. At this time, Roland and Crawley thought of the same spot. He set up the spike net where he initially caught 2 fish, hoping for continued success. Suddenly, Roland turned to see a sight that left him stunned. A large herd of musk deer frolicking on the hillside. In the past, he would have been ready with his bow and arrow, but now he doesn't need the deer meat, and catching a group of animals is more difficult and dangerous. Roland simply watched them leave. The next day, the weather worsened. Roland also slipped while checking traps, hitting his knee hard on a rock. Fortunately, he had no old injuries. Otherwise, a recurrence like Corey's, leading to withdrawal, would have been too great a loss. Today the lake waves were fierce, tangling the spike net and risking it being washed away. Roland considered retrieving it, but feared falling into the lake. Instead, he used a 6-meter log to make a pole and managed to retrieve the spike net with great difficulty. Turning to Kaylin, her lasso trap caught a ptarmigan, similar to a snow hare and mostly lean meat, providing little fat. She also wanted to fish from the lake, but weeks of fishing from the shore yielded nothing. She had to wait for the lake to freeze over to fish in deeper waters through the ice. On the 48th day of survival, the lake in Kaylin's area finally froze. However, according to her experience, the ice was not yet thick enough to support her weight. After waiting another day, the ice was sufficiently thick. She went to the deep water area, drilled a small hole about 30 centimeters square, laid a layer of spruce branches for a seat, and began her ice fishing venture. After a tough 2.5 hours, Kaylin finally caught a lake trout, her first fish since the competition began. Her mood was comparable to that of a successful candidate in an imperial examination. Not knowing how much time had passed, she caught another lake trout, larger than the first. Kaylin felt that if things continued this way, she might be able to last 100 days and win the prize money. Looking back, Amos had planned to go out and set several traps, but as soon as he stepped outside, he was frightened by the sight of a wolf pack surrounding his shelter. He counted 7 or 8 wolves, likely attracted by the fresh fish he had hung at the door. Fortunately, the wolves lingered for a few minutes and left without attacking Amos, but the scare was significant for him. On the 51st day, leader Roland discovered a new food source. Recently, he noticed a squirrel on a tree in front of his door that wouldn't leave. This morning, he saw it climbing down with a mushroom in its mouth and realized it had stored many mushrooms in the tree. Roland chopped down the tree with an axe, seizing the squirrel's entire winter stash and storing the mushrooms in a leather pouch he made, filling half a bag. Turning to strongwoman Crawley, the overnight heavy snow buried half of her lasso, making catching snow hares particularly difficult. She had to raise the lasso a few centimeters by feel to prevent it from being buried again. Previously, Crawley had tracked a porcupine den but never found it at home during her visits. Today, she planned to check again. Porcupines have fat-rich bodies, and the last one she caught lasted her a week. Catching this one could solve her current difficulties. She saw fresh bite marks on nearby trees, indicating the porcupine was still alive. Crawley set a lasso trap on its path, planning to return later to check it. After catching 2 fish, Kaylin's confidence soared. Today, she flexed her muscles for the camera and continued ice fishing. After waiting 3 hours, she caught a whitefish, but unfortunately, it escaped when she retrieved it too quickly. Kaylin was so frustrated that she jumped 3 meters high. Only this fish took the bait today, making her wonder if her beginner's luck had worn off. Amos still had half a salmon left. Seeing that the lake was slow to freeze, he polished some metal into shiny pieces, planning to try his luck by the lake tomorrow. A few days ago, Crawley set a trap at the porcupine den. This morning she went to check, expecting success, but found the trap pushed aside. She decided to risk crawling into the den. If she got stuck in the narrow crevice, she could freeze to death. Fortunately, She saw what she wanted. The porcupine was hiding deep within. Crawley drove it toward the back entrance, and then returned to the front to shoot it with an arrow. The porcupine died without knowing it would be trapped and shot in its own home. Crawley got what she wanted. The porcupine, weighing over 20 pounds, would completely turn her situation around, just as she had hoped. The porcupine, fatty as expected, was prepared for a feast. Unexpectedly, the liver was spotted with white, a sign of tularemia, posing a risk of infection if consumed. Faced with the dilemma, Crawley had to decide whether to eat the diseased animal to sustain herself or risk continuing without it. Day 54. Challenge Amos took his fishing gear to the lakeside, knowing that the fish were in the deep water. He decided to try his luck anyway. Surprisingly, he got a bite within an hour, but like Canon, the fish escaped halfway through. No more bites came before nightfall. Canon still had 2 fish left from the day before yesterday, and didn't plan to go out for food today. She stayed inside her shelter to rest. While a fish stew simmered on the stove, she rubbed her feet clean. By the time her feet were clean, the fish was cooked. Canon savored the fish. She even licked her fingers clean after eating. Though she planned to rest, the ventilation pipe got blocked by snow, trapping smoke inside the shelter. This caused her much distress, with tears and a runny nose. She had been trying to improve her smoked meat techniques, suspecting that the local air pressure was affecting the smoking quality. By the next morning, Canon broke down emotionally. As the challenge progressed, the mental state of the participants became very sensitive. Sometimes, a small incident could be the last straw. Feeling close to his limit, he went back to the forest to retrieve his set lasso traps, preparing to possibly quit the competition. Back to Amos, he had been without food for nearly 3 days. With no ice forming on the lake and feeling his body fat depleting, the fire was his only source of warmth. Eventually, he made the call to withdraw from the challenge. By day 64, the snow on the ground was increasing by 10 centimeters daily. Crawley's lasso traps were still unsuccessful, and she had to reset them daily to prevent them from being buried. With little rabbit meat left, she considered eating the meat of porcupines known to carry tularemia. After a good cry, Canon released her emotions and decided to keep going. She dug a pit under the cabin to serve as a fireplace, which effectively improved the smoke ventilation. After fishing at the lake for 2.5 hours the next morning, she caught a fish. Her excitement was indescribable. It was enough food for several days. She took it back, cut it into several pieces, and alternated between meals to make it last for about a week. After eating, she took out the snowshoe frames she had made and spent half an hour tying umbrella cords in various directions, crafting the shoe uppers. Her handiwork was quite impressive. Roland's days also became tougher. With the last few months expected to be the most challenging, he wanted to gather rose hips while they were still available. Unexpectedly, he found a porcupine eating the rose hips. Seeing the opportunity for a substantial meal, and considering the slow speed of the porcupine, Roland killed it with a stick. The porcupine was exceptionally fatty, providing much-needed fat for the winter. Type 72. Survival Challenge. Roland finished gnawing on the bones in his shelter, then started a bonfire outside. He roasted the porcupine over the fire to burn off the spiny hair, keeping the skin intact to preserve all the fat. That evening, Roland feasted on a large shank. Over the last 7 days, Crawley had lost 20 pounds and urgently needed to consume fat to maintain her weight. After much thought, she decided to go for the porcupine meat. Since she had already been exposed to a potentially infectious environment while processing the animal, and hadn't fallen ill, she believed it was preventable. Crawley stewed the meat over the fire, turning it frequently to ensure it was thoroughly cooked. When she finally tasted the fat, it was like a dry sponge soaking up water. She had been craving this meal for days. After eating her fill, she felt revitalized. Crawley also collected enough wood to keep the fire going at night. While gathering, she felt a sharp pain in her right shoulder and discovered a porcupine quill had embedded itself in her flesh. It was not a trivial matter as it could cause internal damage if not removed. Fortunately, the emergency kit provided by the show included tweezers, which Crawley used to remove the quill. By day 75, Roland wanted to eat the last piece of brisket bone, but found that mice had nibbled away the fat on it. Now that fat was more valuable than protein, he quickly checked his stash of porcupine fat and buffalo bones. He was furious to find that the bones had been cleaned by the mice. He threw the remaining parts into a bag made from buffalo hide and hung it from the smoky ceiling to deter further theft. Canon managed to survive another week by fishing in the lake. After finishing her fish head soup, she returned to the frozen lake to fish again. After 2 hours of waiting, she was about to haul in a fresh catch when it slipped off the hook. Frustrated, she broke down crying on the ice, overwhelmed by thoughts of giving up. By day 80, unable to bear the hunger any longer, Kaylin chose to leave the competition. By then, temperatures in the area had dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. Roland wore a wool coat and black bear gloves to stay warm. Finally, the lake in front of his stone shelter froze solid, and he decided to try ice fishing to replenish his fat stores. He took careful precautions against falling through thin ice by carrying a long pole. After using an axe to make a rectangular hole in the ice, he waited 3 hours with no luck. Roland knew it wasn't his day. Meanwhile, Crawley also tried ice fishing, using rabbit fur and porcupine innards as bait. She couldn't stand outside for 3 hours like Roland, as she had recently discovered frostbite on her right big toe, which had turned purple. Further deterioration could lead to irreversible damage or even amputation. Roland, who had collected berries in the first 3 months, now eats the last of them, saved for today. To his dismay, the berries stored under moss on the warm ceiling have molded and spoiled. Roland then turns to a corner, where a cow stomach filled with undigested grass lies. Despite its taste, the nutrition is high. He boils it into a mushy meal. Cut to Crawley, her face always smiling. The porcupine she has been eating is nearly gone. Today, hoping for a snow hare, she checks her snares. Her smile seems to bring luck. She catches a hare, securing food for the next 2 days. Crawley cleans the hare at her shelter, fries it in porcupine fat, and enjoys the exceptionally tasty, high-protein meal. Meanwhile, Roland is on the lake ready to break the ice for water when a blizzard suddenly hits. The visible tree line blurs into white. Needing water, he follows his footprints back to shore before they're covered by fresh snow. Crawley, undeterred, continues ice fishing but isn't as lucky as Kaylin. She doesn't catch a single fish. Her frostbitten toes force her back to the fire periodically. After the hare and porcupine are gone, she resorts to boiling bones for soup, which quickly becomes no different from plain water. By day 89, Crawley receives a message from the show's crew to stay in her shelter for a medical check. Soon, a helicopter lands and a doctor arrives to assess her frostbite, which is progressing towards irreversible damage in a nutritionally poor environment. Following the show's rules, they terminate Crawley's challenge. She had maintained a great attitude throughout. Without the frostbite, she likely could have lasted 100 days. Now, only Roland remains. Tonight, Roland's meal is a bison hoof. Facing the last of the muskox meat, he ensures every part is utilized. The cooked hoof looks unappetizing and tastes like chewing a shoe sole, but it is nutritionally substantial. On day 92, Roland tries ice fishing again, but with the same luck as before. For the final days, he decides not to struggle anymore. He chops wood and splits firewood by day, spending nights by the fire, reflecting on his family and late mother. Finally reaching day 100, Roland carves the last mark on his calendar tree. The show's crew brings his sister Megan, and they embrace excitedly to celebrate his victory. Roland brings out a bone marrow he had been reluctant to eat, calling it butter found in the wild. Ultimately, Roland's exceptional courage and perseverance earn him the championship.